Harry, you came to Northern Ireland at a time when restorative justice was probably very little known about it, and in the Shankill here, they were trying to apply it in a particularly unique situation with punishment beatings. How did you find the first early stages of working with alternatives?
Well, initially, on both sides of the road, both in the Shankill and in Republican West Belfast, there were fairly organic efforts to deal with punishment, violence, and exclusions. And they went by different names initially, and came at the problem after a bit of local research, and that was helpful for both sides. And it's only at a point where they identified a problem, and there were significant community inputs from the police and people on the street, etc., about punishment violence issues. Then it took on this mantle of restorative justice. So the need came first, and no one was really sure what to call it. But then two completely independent events occurred, and probably the story I like best on the Shankill is that Debbie Waters was brought into the equation fairly early on by a board, and she used the terminology, and she was well versed in something called restorative justice and restorative justice programming, due to some experiences that she had with a particular justice center in the United States. And so early on, restorative justice was adopted. I think here people carefully considered some of its values, looked quite critically at a North American model, which they should have and did, and really developed a model of restorative justice suited to this time and place. And Northern Ireland Alternatives is an excellent example of that. Taking a set of ideas and core values and stringing that into an ethos over a long period of time in terms of how it does its work. And so that's the experience. My learning curve has been very, very steep here. I mean, I may have been called an expert in restorative justice. I'm probably a pretty good student of restorative justice and not an expert in it, but I've learned a great deal here. And it wasn't long at all before restorative justice, talked about on this island, had a very distinctive imprint of its own. And international observers would have made that calculation that this is something different and ideally suited, and particular needs here that aren't elsewhere, and particular kinds of resources here that aren't elsewhere, and that ideas of restorative justice absolutely had to respond to that in order to be relevant. Restorative justice grew up here in the context of a particular phase, that a rawness that occurred after the Accord, something that wasn't addressed, although acknowledged, and that was this issue that local organizations would do local policing, and it would be rough justice, and caught in the crossfire, so to speak, of community anger and discord were a lot of young people who were doing nothing more than what young people did, antisocial behavior, crime, etc. But punishment for that was quite severe, and communities grew less and less tolerant of that, I think, and there was this need and this possibility, and some people jumped into that, and fortunately some funders jumped into that and made available really a unique set of resources to develop programs that might address the issue of punishment violence. So this is a very severe test of a concept which in North American context anyway had never been tested too hard. And so that certainly made it unique, and getting significant groups here to buy into this. And over all those years, just the amount of hysteria from time to time here in this place politically over restorative justice certainly made it different. You know, it became a real political football here. And the amount of attention it got from international bodies and domestic regulatory and enforcement bodies was just nothing short of, you know, extraordinary. And I always thought it was a real battle about who was going to control justice in the local community. That was it in a nutshell, and that was the threat of restorative justice. But, you know, on the positive side of things, if you can screen out all that kind of political noise, white noise, if you will, there was something very important going on in communities, and that is that this appetite and lack of resource that communities had that ended up in violence against young people was being satisfied with something else. We were developing a local option. There was local resourcing of local people to deliver a different kind of justice, and a justice that a lot of people found satisfying. Certainly not everybody. But a lot of people were happy for this alternative. They were happy enough for the trouble to stop in certain areas with some young people. They were happy enough as victims to see some good come out of this, or to have their particular needs met. And Northern Ireland Alternative, certainly as an organization, did do a significant amount for victims. Their victim programs were very significant compared to many other restorative justice programs here and abroad, where there was a lot of lip service to victims. This organization had victims programs. So that was unique. That restorative justice had always said it was about that, but seeing that in practice here was real different too. So that was taken very seriously. And of course, at the end of the day, this was about trying to change military organizations as well, and relieve them, if you will, of what some saw as a kind of final civic responsibility to do this local policing. And I think communities found this nonviolent resource, increasingly used this nonviolent resource, and over time the military organizations were able to just kind of duck out of that and define that not as a responsibility anymore, and instead make the proper referrals, get out of the punishment business. And you know, that's not been 100%, but it has certainly been a significant move forward on a very prickly issue, which was never negotiated with the Belfast Accord. And it was well known that if you didn't do something about community violence, that this just wouldn't be a sustainable peace deal. And certainly these programs did their bit in terms of dealing with local violence against young people. Certainly one of the things we learned from alternatives, because the original program was just here in the Upper Shankill Woodville Park area, one of the first things we learned, and it was very good, is that if we gave our attention to a relatively small group of young people who were causing trouble in the community, we had a significant impact on crime in the community, far in excess of those seemingly small numbers. And so Northern Ireland Alternative started with an intensive caseload model, and it actually worked very well. If you had properly identified, and this was not rocket science, you could do this, if you had properly identified the 12 or 15 most troublesome young people, everybody felt relief, from the police station all the way down to the estates. I mean, it had really a substantial impact. So if you had the right kids, if you did the right bit of targeting, this wasn't about putting hundreds of people through this program. It never was. It was about the proper targeting, and so that's something we learned very early on. That actually was very good news. The so-called proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. You could see that if you carefully targeted this and used resources very carefully, you could have a big impact on the community. And there was early agreement among, I would serially every year interview statutory representatives that had a relationship with Northern Ireland Alternatives. I would every year interview local police and superintendents and Tennant Street, etc. The input was very consistent. They liked the working relationship with this new organization. They began to trust staff, and the bottom line for them is they saw results, and they felt results immediately. And so they may have expressed it as less attacks on the local police. That may have been one interest, or less crime against elderly people, or more satisfaction from victims when crimes had been committed. I mean, this was expressed in all different ways. I thought the keener insights working with some young people for whom the formal system had been a failure too. They'd gone through all the usual kind of punishments. They'd been harassed by the paramilitaries. They'd gone through, a prosecution, maybe time out of the house, maybe on probation, etc. But some of the kids that statutory organizations that had the worst experiences with fared better in the program, and so that gave us pause. Why are they doing better in this program? And so those are just some examples. I think we were learning. Everyone had an appetite to learn, including the funders, and I think we were learning. And I think my job, better than evaluator, is just to try and monitor that, just to kind of keep track of it and make a record of what in fact we were learning, about this experiment. And over time, when the paramilitary group representatives in the service catchment areas of an expanded Northern Ireland Alternatives, when they made the commitment to stop punishment violence, the statistics were there for everybody to see. And we would have agreement from the police at that time and from paramilitary groups that it had slowed or come to an end. And so there we can say, well, there's a success. I don't know if we set out to do that. We wanted to have an impact. The funders during a second round of funding actually pushed this more. I give them credit for that. Atlantic Philanthropy said, well, let's push this to the end. Let's have it stopped, and we'll call that a success. And so we reoriented ourselves and regirded ourselves for that and went on for a second phase. And there's plenty of credible evidence in those service catchment areas where Northern Ireland Alternatives was active that there were dramatic decreases in punishment, violence, and exclusion. So that was one prize. And I think a second prize that we knew about and would have liked to have had an impact on was delivering some capacity to the community that hadn't been there previously. And this was manifest in a whole variety of ways. I know when we started this program, you didn't have panels when you were trying to employ people, because frankly, you didn't have but one or two, if you had one or two people with the credentials to occupy certain posts. I mean, as an area, this is an area of low infrastructure, and that applies to human and social capital as well. And so trying to find people that could counsel young people and deliver tutoring services to young people and with the right credentials was very, very difficult. And so from early days, Northern Ireland Alternatives had to get involved in bringing people up to speed and in giving the local community a capacity. And I think they participated a great deal in that aspect of community development. And so that was another deliverable at the end of this, something that you could see. Another deliverable is that you gave the community an option. The local boys bought into the option, early on. They saw that they could make a referral instead of a beating, and a young person that went through the program at Northern Ireland Alternatives had a much better outcome then they had been beaten 3 or 4 times. I mean, that it was just fairly obvious, and so there was that local buy-in. But we noted early on that not all the referrals to this program were coming from paramilitaries, that increasingly the public felt free to walk through the door and ask the organization to help them verify a threat, or to help a young person, or to complain that they had been the victim of a crime, etc. So slowly the community is discovering this different way to go, which we called restorative justice, and that it had this credibility, and they'd heard about it from other people. And that certainly was one of the lessons here. I mean, you can spend a lot of money advertising a program, but at the end of the day, if your program works and people talk to each other about it, you know, that's what's going to work best. And we started seeing plenty of evidence of that. So that was another, you know, important deliverable as well. So it wasn't just about punishment violence. It was resourcing a community and developing capacity in the community and developing options for people who felt violence was the only way. Those were all equally as important. Sometimes they didn't get the press. They weren't as sexy as some other things, but in terms of their lasting importance, they're very, very significant. And one can chart over the years, for example, the development of the Shankill program, and then the development of Northern Ireland Alternatives, and look at the way that it's kind of wound its way into community development and significant community work, and as a partner or a significant player, etc. All that develops over the years too. The development of an organization with the development of the community, and that's another really important deliverable. So, you know, kind of all these things together, one ends up with a pretty good feeling about what happened during those years in the development of Northern Ireland Alternatives. Again, the world's not perfect. Sometimes in a peace-building process, it's a step forward, 2 steps back, etc. So one struggles with these sorts of things almost on a daily basis. But, you know, Alternatives has been here for quite a while, and the work has been consistently of high quality, and it has increasing credibility in the community and increasing credibility in the statutory sector, in the voluntary sector, etc. So it's a nice story to tell and reflect on. And again, I think we've learned a great deal along the way.
Okay. So Harry, just finally, in terms of you know, the changes that you've seen, the developments here, what would be your message for those in Alternatives for the future?
Well, I can't imagine what that future is going to be. That's the safest thing to say. The work certainly isn't over in Protestant working class areas. I mean, there's still punishments that go on. I don't think the work should ever be done in terms of being responsible for local trouble and local peace. I think Northern Ireland Alternatives will always have a role there. I don't think that's a role they ought to give up. And so that means that there will always be these nagging conflicts and concessions and accommodations that the organization is going to have to make to other statutory organizations that will always be better resourced to do that work as well, but who might be reluctant in Protestant working class areas to do that work rather than other areas. So I don't think those kind of struggles are going to go away, nor should they. But, you know, justice changes, and the circumstances around justice change, and they've changed dramatically, you know, in the last 20 years. And I would expect that change to go on, and I would expect Northern Ireland Alternatives to worry about its relevance with those changes. I mean, I feel pretty good about it being responsive and being an organic community development, and so I think it will do well. But God, who knows, what that future is going to bring.